The silence of the Colorado Rockies was a language Elias Rourke understood better than the chatter of men. For 6 years, since the guns of the war had finally fallen quiet, this silence had been his only trusted companion. It was in the groan of the ancient pines under the weight of snow, the sharp crack of an ice-sheathed branch giving way, the whisper of the wind that scoured the high peaks and worried the corners of his lonely cabin. He had built the cabin himself, felling the trees and notching the logs with hands that were as comfortable with an axe as they had once been with a rifle. It was a simple, sturdy thing. 1 room, a stone hearth that was its beating heart, and a single window that looked out on a world of white and gray. Elias was a man carved from the same hard granite as the mountains he called home. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was a landscape of its own, with lines etched around his eyes and a beard the color of frosted timber. He moved with a deliberate economy of motion, the way a predator does, wasting nothing, not a step, not a breath, not a word. The war had burned away everything extraneous in him, leaving only a hard, functional core. He had seen the depths of what men could do to one another in the name of God and country, and he had found it rotten. So he had come here, to this unforgiving altitude, to be cleansed by the cold and the quiet, to forget the smell of blood and gunpowder that still clung to his memories like a shroud. His days were a rhythm of survival. He'd rise before the sun, his breath pluming in the frigid air of the cabin, and set the fire to life. He'd check his trap lines for the marten and beaver that would fetch a fair price come the spring thaw. He'd chop wood, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only percussion in the vast, silent orchestra of the wilderness. He spoke more to his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Jed, than he had to any human in the past year. The horse didn't judge, didn't lie, and didn't ask for anything but hay and a firm hand. It was an honest transaction, and honesty was the only currency Elias still valued. The storm came on the 3rd day of December, a white devil howling down from the north. It wasn't just snow, it was a living, breathing fury that erased the world, blurring the lines between earth and sky. Elias had been out checking a line near the Black Maw Ravine, a treacherous gash in the mountainside that was known to swallow careless travelers. The wind tore at him, driving ice crystals into his skin like tiny needles. He was pulling a silver fox from a trap, its fur a perfect, unblemished prize, when a flicker of color against the blinding white caught his eye. It was wrong. In this world of monochrome, color was an intruder. He squinted, his eyes watering from the cold, a patch of blue, half buried in a drift near the ravine's edge. Cursing under his breath, he secured the fox and trudged toward it, his snowshoes sinking deep with each step. He expected a lost parcel, maybe a blanket dropped from a passing wagon on the lower trail weeks ago. It was a woman. She was curled into a ball, like a frozen bird fallen from its nest. The blue he'd seen was the thin calico of her dress, a garment wholly unfit for a pleasant autumn day, let alone a winter tempest. Her shawl was a flimsy thing, tangled around her head, and her face, peeking out from the snow, was as pale as marble, except for the bruise, a dark, ugly stain, the color of a dying plum, blossomed across her cheekbone and the delicate skin around her eye. She was unconscious, or worse. For a long moment, Elias did nothing. He stood over her, the wind whipping his beard across his face, a cold more profound than the storm settling in his gut. A person, a woman, a problem. The world of men he had fled had just deposited one of its broken pieces on his doorstep. His first instinct, raw and sharp, was to turn away, to walk back to his cabin, stoke his fire, and let the snow do its work. The mountain was indifferent. It took what it wanted. He could be indifferent, too. But the war hadn't burned everything away. Beneath the cynicism and the solitude, a stubborn ember of something else remained, the part of him that had once pulled a screaming comrade from a river of mud and blood, the part that knew you didn't leave a body to the elements, not even a dead one. He knelt, his knees cracking in the cold, and pulled off a thick leather glove. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck. A pulse, faint, thready, as fragile as a spider's silk, but it was there. And then he saw her chest give a shallow, shuddering rise. A breath, so weak it barely disturbed the snowflakes melting on her lips. With a grunt that was equal parts resignation and effort, he scooped her up. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of cold bones and thin cloth. Her head lolled against his chest, her frozen hair crackling against his coat. The journey back to the cabin was a battle. The wind fought him for every step, trying to rip the fragile burden from his arms. The woman was a dead weight, and the cold was seeping into her, a deep, lethal chill that he could feel even through his layers of wool and hide. He kicked the cabin door open and practically fell inside, the storm roaring at his back before he slammed the heavy planks shut, plunging the room into the dim, fire-lit twilight. He laid her down on the bearskin rug before the hearth, her body looking small and impossibly out of place in the rustic severity of his home. His survival instincts took over. He worked quickly, his movements sure and practiced. He stoked the fire until it blazed, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. He stripped the frozen, wet dress from her body with a detached efficiency, averting his eyes from her nakedness. Her skin was mottled blue and white, and more bruises, old and new, marred her ribs and arms. He wrapped her in his driest wool blankets, piling them on top of her, and then filled a kettle with snow to melt over the fire. It was as he was propping her head up to try and trickle some warm water between her lips that he heard it, a sound from deep within her chest, a wet, ragged noise, like tearing cloth. It was a sound he knew from the field hospitals, from the beds of men whose lungs had been filled with fluid and despair. She was drowning from the inside out. A moment later, her body was racked by a violent, deep cough. It was a terrible, wrenching spasm that seemed to tear through her slight frame. She coughed again, and a small, bright spatter of blood appeared on the dark wool of the blanket near her mouth. Elias stared at the crimson stain. Lung damage, severe. From the cold, yes, but maybe something more. That bruise on her face wasn't from a fall in the snow. He worked through the night, a grim sentinel by the fire. He boiled herbs, yarrow and mullein, creating a pungent steam for her to inhale, a trick a Ute shaman had shown him years ago. He kept the warm water coming, forcing a few drops past her lips whenever she seemed able to swallow. He watched the unsteady rise and fall of her chest, listening to that awful, liquid sound with every breath she took. And he thought of his younger brother, Caleb, with his easy smile and his foolish dreams, who had never understood Elias's darkness. It was Caleb who had spoken of mail-order brides, of sending for a woman from the east to fill the emptiness of a frontier life. Elias had scoffed at the idea, calling it buying a pig in a poke, but Caleb had been lonely. 2 years ago, a letter had arrived for Caleb from a woman in St. Louis. Elias had found it after the mining accident that took his brother's life. A simple, hopeful letter, with a photograph of a plain-faced girl and a promise to arrive on the autumn train. She had never come. Caleb had waited, his hope souring into bitterness, before a misplaced stick of dynamite had rendered it all moot. Elias looked at the woman sleeping fitfully by his fire. Was this her? The bride who had never arrived? Had she been delayed, lost her way, and finally, foolishly, tried to make the journey up the mountain on her own? It was the only explanation that made any sense. Sometime near dawn, her eyes fluttered open. They were a startlingly clear shade of blue, wide with a terror so profound it seemed to steal the very air from the room. Her gaze darted around the cabin, at the rough-hewn walls hung with traps and cured pelts, at the rifle mounted over the door, at the hulking, bearded stranger staring down at her. He saw the hunted look of a cornered animal. But then, her eyes settled on the fire, on the solid, encompassing warmth of the small room, and for a fleeting second, the terror was replaced by an expression of desperate, soul-deep longing for the safety it represented. "You're safe," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "You were caught in the storm." She tried to speak, but it came out as a weak, wheezing gasp. He held a cup of water to her lips. She drank, her throat working convulsively. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice even. "Gentle?" "Tessa," she whispered. The sound was no louder than the rustle of dry leaves. He nodded slowly. Tessa. He didn't recognize the name from the letter, but he couldn't rightly recall the name that had been in it, either. "You just rest, Tessa. The storm's still blowing. You're in no shape to go anywhere." He told himself it was a practical matter. The blizzard raged for another 2 days, burying the cabin up to its window. Even after it stopped, the trails would be impassable for weeks, maybe longer. She was too weak to travel, her lungs too damaged. To try and move her would be a death sentence. He was stuck with her, at least until the spring thaw. His solitude was broken, his silence invaded. A quiet resentment simmered in him, but it was banked by the undeniable reality of her condition. He was a survivor, and the first rule of survival was to deal with the world as it was, not as you wished it to be. The first few days passed in a heavy silence. He tended to her needs with a gruff, impersonal care. He made her thin broth from salted venison, helped her sit up to breathe the herbal steam, and kept the fire roaring. She, in turn, watched him, her wide, wary eyes following his every move. She did not speak of how she came to be in the snow, and he did not ask. The unspoken questions hung between them, as thick and cold as the air outside. On the 4th night, he was jolted from a light sleep by a sound. It wasn't a cough, but a soft, choked whimper. He sat up on his cot. In the flickering firelight, he could see her shoulders shaking under the pile of blankets. She was crying, silent tears tracing paths down her pale cheeks. He stayed still, uncertain. He was a man of action, not of comfort. Words of solace were a foreign language to him. He was about to lie back down, to grant her the privacy of her grief, when she spoke, her voice a fractured whisper, directed at no one and everyone. "I can't breathe." The words were not a complaint. They were a simple, devastating statement of fact. It wasn't just the fluid in her lungs, he realized. It was the fear, the pain, the memory of whatever had put that bruise on her face and that terror in her eyes. It was the weight of a life that was suffocating her. And in that moment, she ceased to be a problem, a complication, or the ghost of his brother's foolish dreams. The walls of indifference he had so carefully built around his heart trembled. For the first time since he had carried her out of the snow, Elias Rourke truly saw the woman by his fire, and he felt the cold, silent world he had made for himself crack, just a little, letting in a sliver of warmth and terrifying light. The days that followed settled into a tense, fragile rhythm, dictated by the fire, the storm, and the ragged cadence of Tessa's breathing. The small cabin, once Elias's solitary fortress, now felt crowded with the presence of another soul. They moved around each other like wary animals forced to share a den, a silent contract of proximity drawn between them. Elias was the guardian, brusque and efficient. Tessa was the ghost, a silent observer who flinched at sudden movements and whose eyes held a permanent shadow of fear. His life, once a simple loop of survival tasks, was now complicated by the demands of a fragile body. He found himself in the unfamiliar role of a healer, a role he accepted with the same grim determination he applied to everything else. He scoured his small stock of supplies, his memory reaching back to things learned from his mother, from old mountain men, from the grim necessities of the battlefield. He brewed a dark, bitter tea from the dried mullein leaves he kept for his own winter coughs, forcing her to drink the steaming liquid 3 times a day. He took the last of his meager supply of cornmeal and made a thin, watery gruel. The only thing she seemed able to keep down. He would spoon it to her like a child, his large, calloused hands looking clumsy and oversized as he held the small wooden bowl. He never met her eyes during these moments, focusing instead on the task, his jaw set in a hard line. He taught her how to breathe. When her lungs seized and the wet, rattling sound in her chest grew louder, he would sit her up and make her inhale the steam from a kettle filled with pine needles and yarrow. "Slow," he would command, his voice a low growl. "Pull it in slow. Don't fight it." He was teaching her a skill he himself had perfected, the art of enduring pain without giving into panic. Outside, the winter tightened its grip. The snow piled up against the door, forcing Elias to dig a trench to get out. It drifted higher than the single window, plunging the cabin into a perpetual twilight, lit only by the ceaseless fire and the pale, filtered light from above. At night, the world shrank to the size of their small room, and the sounds of the wilderness pressed in. The wind shrieked through the pines, a mournful, lonely sound that scraped at the nerves, and sometimes, far off, they would hear the howling of a wolf pack, a chilling, predatory chorus that spoke of hunger and the unforgiving laws of nature. For Tessa, the sounds were a source of terror, her hands often tightening on the blanket. For Elias, they were a familiar lullaby, but now they carried a different resonance. He was no longer just protecting himself. He was guarding this small, flickering flame of a life that had been thrust into his care. The long, fire-lit hours began to work on him, chipping away at the fortress he'd built around his past. The war had taught him that the night was for ghosts, and his ghosts were many. He would sit by the hearth, long after Tessa had fallen into a fitful sleep, cleaning his rifle or sharpening a knife, and the memories would come unbidden. He saw the fog-shrouded fields of Antietam, the ground so slick with blood it was impossible to keep your footing. He heard the high-pitched scream of a boy from his regiment, not more than 16, clutching a stomach wound and calling for a mother who would never hear him again. He smelled the cloying sweetness of gangrene in the field tents, a smell that had soaked into the very fabric of his soul. He remembered the breaking point. It hadn't been a single battle, but the slow, grinding erosion of his belief in anything, in God, in country, in the inherent goodness of man. He had seen generals send thousands to their deaths for a few yards of meaningless dirt. He had seen men who prayed on Sunday turn into savages on Monday. When it was all over, when the flags were raised and the speeches were made, he couldn't see the victory. He saw only the graves, the empty chairs at family tables, the vast, silent field of loss. He had come home to find his family farm sold, his parents gone, and the world he had fought for unrecognizable. So he had turned his back on it all and walked west, and then up, until the air was thin and clean and the voices of men were a distant memory. Tessa's presence was a strange and unwelcome echo of that lost world. He resented it, yet he couldn't abandon it. Slowly, like a winter sunrise, she began to thaw. It started with a word, then a phrase. She asked for water instead of waiting for him to bring it. She thanked him, her voice barely a whisper. When he adjusted her blankets, he learned the topography of her illness, the times of day when her breathing was worst, the type of cough that signaled a bad spell coming. One afternoon, as he sat stripping the fat from a beaver pelt, she spoke from her bed of furs. "I was meant to be a bride." The words hung in the quiet air. Elias kept his eyes on his work, his knife moving in a steady, practiced line. "That's so," he grunted, neither a question nor a statement. "A mail-order bride," she continued, her voice gaining a little strength. "My intended, he lived in a town down the mountain, Argent Falls." Elias paused, his knife still. Argent Falls. That was the mining town where Caleb had worked, where he had died. The pieces were fitting together, confirming his initial suspicion. "I was on the stagecoach," she said, her voice dropping. "But there was a problem. I never made it to the town. I got lost." It was a threadbare explanation, full of holes he could have driven a wagon through. A woman didn't just get lost from a stagecoach and end up half dead in a blizzard miles up a mountain. her face bruised and her body broken. But it was a start. It was the first piece of her story she had offered him, and he accepted it with a quiet nod. He would not push. He knew what it was to carry a story you weren't ready to tell. The night the crisis came, the air in the cabin was thick and still, heavy with an impending storm. Tessa had been restless all day, her breathing more shallow, her skin feverish to the touch. Just after midnight, she was seized by a coughing fit so violent it seemed to lift her from the bed. It was a brutal, deep, hacking sound that tore from her lungs, a desperate battle for air. He was at her side in an instant, lifting her into a sitting position. Her body was rigid, her back arched as another spasm racked her. She choked, her eyes wide with panic. "Can't breathe," she gasped, her fingers clawing at the blankets. The herbal steam wasn't enough. The air in the cabin was too close, too warm. He needed to shock her system, to force air into her starving lungs. Acting on pure instinct, he swept the blankets around her and lifted her into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, a bird made of hollow bones. He kicked the door open and carried her out into the night. The cold was a physical blow. It was razor sharp, so intense it burned the skin. The snow was falling again, thick, silent flakes in the darkness. He held her tight against his chest, her head tucked under his chin, and stood in the biting wind. The shock of the frigid air on her face and in her throat made her gasp, a deep, shuddering inhalation that was followed by another, and then another. The violent coughing subsided, replaced by a ragged, wheezing struggle. But she was breathing. Air was getting in. He held her there for long minutes, his own body a shield against the worst of the wind, feeling the frantic, terrified hammering of her heart against his ribs. It was the most contact he'd had with another human being in years. He could feel the sharp, frail angles of her body through the wool, the unnatural thinness of her arms, the way her ribs felt beneath his hand. And that's when he felt it. Not just bruises, but a pattern, the distinct, hard ridge of a rib that had healed badly, out of place, the tender, swollen flesh over her kidneys, the way she instinctively curled inward to protect her stomach. He had held men who had been kicked by mules, men who had fallen from scaffolds, men who had been crushed in rock slides. Their injuries were chaotic, random, the result of impartial physics. This was different. This was methodical. The bruises on her face, the marks on her arms, the damage to her ribs. They weren't from a long journey or a fall in the cold. This was the work of a fist, of a boot. This was the deliberate, cruel art of breaking a person piece by piece. A cold, hard rage, an emotion he hadn't felt with such clarity since the war, solidified in his chest. He looked down at the woman shivering in his arms, her face pale in the faint starlight, and the last of his detachment shattered. She wasn't his brother's lost bride. She was a fugitive. She was running from the man, or men, who had done this to her. And she had run right into the heart of his mountain, his sanctuary, bringing the very violence he had sought to escape right to his door. He carried her back inside and laid her gently by the fire. Her breathing had eased, the wheezing less pronounced. She was exhausted, her eyes fluttering closed. As he arranged the blankets around her, his fingers brushed the dark, faded bruise on her cheek. It was no longer an abstract injury. It was a testament, a story written on her skin that she was not yet ready to speak aloud. And he, Elias Rourke, the man who wanted nothing to do with the world, found himself its unwilling reader. The knowledge of Tessa's injuries changed something fundamental in the air of the cabin. It was no longer a simple space of shelter. It had become a repository for a secret Elias could feel but not yet name. His suspicion, once a fleeting thought, now took root. He started to watch her, not with the detached eye of a caretaker, but with the sharp, analytical gaze of a man who knew how to read a battlefield. He saw the way she mapped the single room with her eyes, noting the door, the window, the placement of his rifle, as if calculating angles of escape. He saw the way her hands trembled when he entered the cabin suddenly, The way she would wrap her arms around her midsection, a gesture of unconscious self-protection. Her nights were the most revealing. The thin partition of sleep was a veil she could not control, and the terrors she kept locked away during the day came crawling out in the darkness. He would lie on his cot, listening to the fire crackle and the wind moan, and he would hear her. A soft whimper at first, then a restless tossing under the furs. Her breathing would quicken, that ragged, shallow sound he had come to know so well, but it would be laced with a new sound, fear. One night, a name slipped past her lips, a choked, terrified whisper. "Ryland, no, please!" Elias lay perfectly still, the name echoing in the silent cabin. Ryland. It was a solid, authoritative name, not the kind of name you'd expect from a common drifter or trail bandit. He filed it away. Another piece of a puzzle he didn't want to solve but could no longer ignore. He had seen men in the grip of battle dreams, had heard them cry out for their mothers or curse the enemy. Tessa's nightmares were different. She wasn't fighting back, she was pleading. His supply of mullein was running low, and the yarrow was nearly gone. Her cough had settled into a chronic, deep-seated rattle that worsened in the cold mornings. And he knew he needed something stronger, something he couldn't find on the mountainside in the dead of winter. He needed laudanum, or, at the very least, a proper cough syrup from an apothecary. The thought of going down to Argent Falls curdled his gut. It was a 4-hour trek in good weather, a full day's ordeal in this snow. More than that, it was a return to the world of men, a world of noise, greed, and deceit. But when he saw Tessa shiver through a coughing fit that left her pale and breathless, he knew he had no choice. He set out before dawn, leaving a mountain of firewood stacked by the hearth and a pot of broth on the embers. "Keep the fire hot," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Don't open the door for anyone." She just nodded, her eyes large and fearful in the firelight, watching him as he strapped on his snowshoes and slung his rifle over his shoulder. Argent Falls was just as he remembered it, a raw scar carved into the valley, perpetually shrouded in a haze of wood smoke and smelting fumes. The single main street was a river of mud and slush, lined with false-fronted buildings that housed saloons, a land office, and the general store that was his destination. The town was populated by men with hard eyes and acquisitive hands, men who sought to tear wealth from the earth and cared little for what they destroyed in the process. Elias moved through them like a ghost, his buckskins and mountain man beard setting him apart, his cold, quiet demeanor a clear warning to be left alone. He bought what he needed at the general store, a small, dark bottle of cough syrup, laudanum, salt, and a sack of flour. As he was paying, the proprietor, a balding man with a nervous twitch, eyed him curiously. "You live up on the high peaks, don't you?" Elias grunted in affirmation, counting out his coins. "Thought I recognized you. Don't see you down here but once, maybe twice a year." The man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Say, you been up there, all alone. You ain't seen a stray woman, have you?" Elias's hands stilled. He kept his face impassive, his gaze fixed on the counter. "Can't say that I have." The proprietor chuckled, a greasy, unpleasant sound. "Wouldn't that be something? Found money. She's a runaway. A pretty little thing. Dark hair, blue eyes. Came in on the stage a few weeks back. Supposed to be the new housekeeper for Judge Ryland himself." The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Ryland, the judge. Turned out to be a thieving little whore, is what I hear. The man continued, warming to his topic. Stole a silver locket from the judge and lit out in the middle of the night, right before that first big storm hit. The judge is fit to be tied. Put a bounty on her. He did. $50 for her return. Says she's his property. In a manner of speaking. And he wants her back. A cold, familiar fire began to burn in Elias's belly. The fire of the war. The fire of injustice. He looked at the proprietor. his eyes flat and hard as river stones. "People get lost in the mountains," he said, his voice low and even. "Especially this time of year. The snow buries everything." He took his parcel and turned to leave, the man's voice following him. "Well, if you see her, $50 is $50. Just bring her to the judge." The journey back up the mountain was a grim ascent. The proprietor's words echoed with every crunch of his snowshoes. Asterisk Judge Ryland, his property, thieving whore. It was a story, neat and tidy, designed to turn an entire town into a posse. A story that painted Tessa as a criminal and this Judge Ryland as the victim. But it didn't account for the bruises. It didn't account for the broken rib, the terror in her eyes, or the blood she coughed up from her lungs. He knew what kind of men held power in towns like Argent Falls. Men who wrote the laws to suit themselves. Men for whom justice was a commodity to be bought and sold. The truth was a dangerous thing in their hands, easily twisted into whatever shape they desired. He was still a mile from the cabin when he saw it. A thin trail of disturbed snow, leading away from his door and heading west, towards the treacherous, unsettled wilderness. Footprints, small, uncertain. Hers. His heart hammered against his ribs. The fool. The goddamn little fool. Where did she think she was going? She wouldn't last a day. He broke into a run, his long legs eating up the distance, his rifle held tight in his hand. He found her not a quarter-mile away. She had stumbled and fallen into a deep drift. She was trying to push herself up, her thin arms trembling with the effort. But she had no strength. She had taken one of his blankets, but it wasn't enough. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. As he approached, she looked up, and he saw not defiance, but sheer animal panic. She scrambled backward, trying to get away from him. "Stay back," she gasped, her voice thin and reedy. And then the coughing started. It was worse than he had ever seen it, a deep, racking spasm that bent her double. She collapsed onto the snow, her body convulsing. He reached her side just as she coughed into her hand, and when she pulled it away, it was stained with a bright, terrifying crimson. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she went limp. He swore. A raw, vicious sound torn from his throat. All his anger at her foolish escape attempt evaporated, replaced by a surge of primal fear for her life. He scooped her up, blanket and all, and carried her back to the cabin. She was a dead weight in his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder, a faint, bloody froth on her lips. Inside, he laid her on the bearskin rug and worked to bring her back. He forced a few drops of the laudanum-laced syrup between her lips and propped her up, rubbing her hands and feet until some color returned to them. The fear he had seen in her eyes out in the snow was still there, even in her unconsciousness. She wasn't just running from a man. She was running from a cage she believed was closing around her again. That night, he did not return her to her own small bed of furs in the corner. The floor there was drafty, cold. Instead, he took his own bedroll from his cot and spread it on the floor right before the hearth, in the pool of its encompassing warmth. He gently lifted her and laid her down there, pulling the heaviest furs over her. He then took a spare blanket and settled himself on the floor beside her, between her and the door, his back against a log wall. He would keep watch. Hours passed. The fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows. He thought she was asleep when she spoke, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the hiss of the embers. "He'll find me." Elias didn't move. "The judge. He said—" It wasn't a question. A tear slipped from the corner of her eye and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "His name is Judge Marcus Ryland." He waited, letting the silence stretch, giving her the space to fill it. "I wasn't a housekeeper," she whispered, her voice cracking. "And I was never a mail-order bride for your brother. I was a witness. I was working in the hotel in Argent Falls, cleaning the rooms. Judge Ryland had a meeting with a man, a prospector named Finch. They were arguing over a claim. The Whispering Creek claim. It was rich with silver. Finch had the papers, the real ones. The judge wanted it. She took a shuddering breath, the memory making her tremble. I was in the hall. I heard them shouting. Then it stopped. I peeked through the keyhole. I saw the judge standing over Finch. There was a letter opener in his hand. Finch! He was on the floor. There was so much blood. Elias felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. Ryland saw me. She continued, her voice breaking. He caught the door before I could run. He told me that Finch had attacked him, that it was self-defense, but he knew I'd seen his face. He knew I'd heard the argument. He told me no one would believe a nobody cleaning girl over the town judge. He said he would ruin me, or worse. Her story spilled out, a torrent of poison she had held in for too long. Ryland had locked her away, telling the town she was a flighty girl he'd taken under his wing. But in private, he had laid out his plan. He would marry her. As his wife, she could not testify against him. As his wife, she would belong to him. Her voice silenced forever under the protection and authority of his name. The stolen locket was a lie, an excuse he had created after she had finally found a chance to run, a way to brand her a criminal so no one would ever listen to her truth. I ran, she sobbed, the sound muffled by the fur blanket. I just ran. I thought if I could get over the mountains, I could disappear. Elias felt a rage so pure and cold it was like ice in his veins. He thought of his rifle, of the weight of it in his hands, of the clean, final justice it could deliver. He looked at the trembling woman beside him. He reached out, his movements slow, and placed a hand on her shoulder. She flinched, but she didn't pull away. We can go to the U.S. Marshal in Denver, he said, his voice a low rumble. We can tell him what you saw. Tessa let out a choked, bitter laugh. She turned her head, her tear-filled eyes meeting his in the dim light. The Marshal is his cousin, she whispered, the words laced with utter despair. They hunt together every fall. Ryland isn't just the law in Argent Falls. Elias, in this part of the territory, he is the law. She closed her eyes, another tear tracing a path to the blanket. There's no safe place. Tessa's confession was a stone dropped into the quiet pool of their existence, and the ripples changed everything. The secret, now spoken aloud, did not vanish. Instead, it settled between them, a tangible thing they now shared. The cabin, once a place of tense silence, was now filled with a different kind of quiet. A quiet of understanding, of a shared, unspoken pact. The enemy had a name, Judge Marcus Ryland, and the fortress Elias had built for himself now had two occupants to defend. This new reality reshaped their days. The dynamic shifted from that of a wary patient and a gruff nurse to something more akin to reluctant partners in a long siege. Her health was still a fragile thing, the deep, rattling cough a constant reminder of the damage done. But a sliver of strength was returning to her. She began to move about the cabin, her steps tentative at first, then with a growing purpose. She took the mending of his worn-out shirt into her own hands, her small, nimble fingers working the needle with a practiced skill that was a stark contrast to his clumsy attempts. He would watch her from the corner of his eye as she sat by the fire, her brow furrowed in concentration, and feel a strange, unfamiliar pang in his chest. It was the sight of life, of quiet domesticity, in a place he had consecrated to solitude and memory. She brought a softness to the cabin's hard edges. She found a way to make the venison stew less stringy, adding a handful of dried berries she'd found in his stores. She swept the hearth with a makeshift broom of pine boughs until the stones were clean. These were small acts, but in the vast, empty landscape of Elias's life, they were seismic events. He was a man who had forgotten the feel of a mended shirt, the taste of a thoughtfully prepared meal. In return, he began to arm her with his own kind of knowledge. He taught her the language of the mountain, a lexicon of survival written in snow and stone. He showed her how to properly bank the fire at night so a bed of hot coals would be waiting for them in the morning's bitter cold. You don't want to be wasting a match or your breath when it's 20 below, he explained, his voice a low rumble. He took her just outside the cabin door one clear, windless afternoon and pointed out the tracks in the fresh snow. "That's a snowshoe hare," he said, pointing to the distinctive pattern. "Moves fast, hard to catch. And that," he gestured to a series of deeper, single-file prints, "is a fox. He's hunting the hare. Everything up here is either hunting or being hunted." The lesson was not lost on her. She looked from the tracks back to his face, her blue eyes wide and serious. She was learning that survival here was a matter of knowing who was the hunter and who was the prey. These moments of instruction became their new form of conversation. They spoke of practical things: the best wood for a hot fire, how to read the clouds for a coming storm, the importance of keeping the rifle clean and dry. In this shared space of practical knowledge, they found a neutral ground where they could exist without the weight of her past or his ghosts pressing in on them. But intimacy is a stubborn weed. It grows in the most barren soil. The very smallness of the cabin ensured it. They were in constant proximity, a universe of two bodies in a single room. It manifested in fleeting, accidental moments that were charged with an intensity that left them both breathless. His hand would brush against hers as he passed her a cup of water, and a jolt, sharp and electric, would pass between them. He would feel the warmth of her skin, a warmth he hadn't felt from another human in 6 years, and would pull his hand back as if burned. He would catch her watching him, a look of quiet intensity on her face as he split firewood with clean, powerful strokes. Their eyes would meet for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, a whole unspoken conversation would pass between them, of gratitude, of fear, of a dawning, terrifying curiosity. Then she would look away, a faint blush rising on her pale cheeks, and he would swing the axe with a little more force than was necessary. The most difficult moments were the nights. They still slept apart. He on his cot, she on the bedroll by the fire. But the darkness was an intimacy of its own. He would lie awake, listening to the soft sound of her breathing, the occasional sleepy murmur or the sharp intake of breath that signaled the beginning of a nightmare. He fought the urge to go to her, to offer a comfort he didn't know how to give. He was a man built of walls, and he didn't know how to tear them down, even for a moment. One evening, after a week of clear, brutally cold skies, he decided she was strong enough for a proper bath. He spent the afternoon hauling in buckets of snow and melting them over the fire, filling the large wooden tub he used for laundry and his own rare ablutions. The cabin grew warm and humid, the air thick with steam. "It's ready," he grunted, gesturing to the tub. He took his coat and rifle. "I'll check the west trap line. Be back in an hour." He was giving her privacy, a gift as precious as warmth in this place. When he returned, the air was scented with the faint, clean smell of the lye soap and the herbs she had steeped in the water. She was sitting on the bearskin rug before the fire, wrapped in his thickest blanket, her back to him. Her dark hair, clean for the first time since she'd arrived, was a damp, tangled cascade down her back. She was trying to comb through it with her fingers, without success. He hung his coat and rifle on their pegs, his movements slow. The sight of her, so clean and vulnerable in the firelight, was a blow to his senses. He could feel the carefully constructed peace of the last few weeks begin to fray, replaced by a tension that was both frightening and magnetic. "Here," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He walked over to his small chest of belongings and took out his own comb, a sturdy thing carved from bone. She looked up at him, startled, clutching the blanket tighter. He didn't give her a chance to refuse. He knelt on the floor behind her, the old wood groaning under his weight. "Hold still," he commanded softly. He took a section of her damp hair in his hand. It was cool and surprisingly soft against his calloused, scarred fingers. He started at the ends, working the comb gently through the knots. his movements slow and deliberate, the way he would groom his horse to calm it. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft rasp of the comb through her hair. The world shrank to the space between them, to the feel of her hair in his hands, to the sight of her slender shoulders under the blanket. He could feel the warmth radiating from her body, could smell the clean, womanly scent of her skin. It was an act of profound intimacy, more potent than any touch they had shared before. He felt the walls inside him begin to crumble, dust and mortar giving way after years of neglect. He was a man starved, and he hadn't even known he was hungry. He wanted to keep his hands in her hair forever, to stay in this quiet, fire-lit moment where there was no war, no Judge Ryland, no past full of ghosts. Her shoulders began to shake. He thought at first she was cold, but then he heard a small, choked sob. He stopped, his hands still tangled in her hair. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. No one has ever been gentle with me," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. The words were a blade in his gut. He closed his eyes. The image of her bruised face, of the old, healed-over injuries, flashed behind his eyelids. He finished combing her hair in silence. When he was done, he didn't move. He rested his hands on her shoulders, his thumbs gently stroking the tense muscles there. She leaned back slightly, her head resting against his chest. It was a gesture of absolute trust, and it undid him. He lowered his head, his beard brushing against her still damp hair, and turned her face toward him. In the flickering firelight, he saw the tears shimmering on her lashes, the fear warring with a desperate, heartbreaking longing in her eyes. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was gentle, tentative, a soft pressure of his lips against hers. It was a question and a statement. It tasted of wood smoke and tears and all the unspoken words that had passed between them. For a moment, she was still, and then her lips softened under his, a hesitant, answering pressure that sent a tremor through his entire body. He pulled back. The air was thick with the aftermath, with the gravity of the line they had just crossed. Tessa stared at him for a long moment, her blue eyes searching his. Then she turned away, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. Elias felt like a brute. He had pushed her, had taken something she wasn't ready to give. His first instinct was to retreat, to put the distance back between them, to rebuild the walls. He stood up, his joints aching, and moved back to the shadows on his side of the cabin. He had broken the truce. But as he watched her cry, he knew it wasn't that simple. He had not just taken, something had also been given. A crack had been opened in the solitary fortress of his heart, and a fragile, terrifying light was pouring in. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could never go back to being the man he was before she fell out of the snow. The fragile peace of their new intimacy lasted for 3 days. Then, the outside world came for them. It arrived in the form of a man named Silas, the mail carrier who made the treacherous journey up to the high country mining camps once a month. Weather permitting, Elias saw him coming from a long way off, a dark figure moving steadily on snowshoes, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He met Silas outside, positioning himself between the man and the cabin door. Rourke. Silas greeted him with a nod, his face ruddy from the cold. "Got a letter for you. Came all the way up from the valley." He dug inside his thick coat and produced a folded, sealed piece of paper. It wasn't addressed to Elias. It bore the name of his dead brother, Caleb. Elias took it, his face a granite mask. "Thank you. Silas, you want to come in for some coffee?" "Can't," the man said, already turning to go. "Gotta make it to the midnight sun camp before dark. Don't want to meet any mountain lions." Elias watched him until he was out of sight before he went back inside. Tessa was standing by the hearth, her face pale, her hands twisting in the fabric of her dress. She had seen the exchange. He broke the seal. The letter was short, the handwriting a sharp, angry scrawl. Asterisk. It has come to my attention that you are harboring stolen property. The woman, Tessa, is indentured to me by law. Return her to Argent Falls within 3 days. If you fail to comply, I will come for her myself, and you will face the consequences. Consider this your only warning. It was signed, simply, asterisk Judge M. Ryland, asterisk. Elias read the letter twice. A cold, deadly calm settled over him. This was the language he understood. An ultimatum, a declaration of war. He looked at Tessa, at the raw fear in her eyes. He saw the hunter's tracks in the snow, and he knew, with absolute clarity, which side he was on. He walked over to the hearth and, without a word, dropped the letter into the flames. They both watched as the edges curled, blackened, and were consumed, the judge's words turning to ash and smoke. He then turned and walked to the wall where his rifle was mounted. He took it down, his movements deliberate. He picked up his oilcloth and began to clean the weapon, his hands steady, his eyes cold and hard as a winter sky. The time for hiding was over. The judge was coming, and Elias Rourke would be ready. The ashes of Ryland's letter were a silent vow. The moment they vanished into the embers, the quiet waiting ended and the war began. For 2 days, the cabin was no longer a home, but a stronghold, and Elias and Tessa were no longer merely host and guest, but a garrison of 2 against the coming storm. Elias moved with a grim, focused energy he hadn't felt since the siege of Vicksburg. The war had taught him how to turn a piece of land into a fortress, how to think like the men who would come to kill him. He began outside, working in the biting cold. He felled 2 small pines and used them to brace the cabin door from the inside, creating a barricade that would take a battering ram to break. He packed snow and ice into the gaps between the logs, reinforcing the walls against both the cold and stray bullets. He spent hours crafting a deadfall trap on the narrow path leading to the cabin, a lattice of heavy logs propped up by a trigger vine, capable of crushing a horse and its rider. Tessa watched him, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now mingled with a fierce, protective resolve. She would not be a helpless victim cowering by the fire. She became the quartermaster of their small army. She organized their meager supplies, taking inventory of every strip of jerky, every handful of flour, every bullet in the ammunition box. She melted snow constantly, keeping their water barrels full. She tore strips from one of her spare petticoats to make bandages, her hands moving with a steady, determined purpose. She was preparing for a battle, not just for her own life, but for his. They worked together in a rhythm of shared purpose that required few words. He would come in from the cold, his beard caked with ice, and she would have a steaming cup of chicory coffee waiting for him. She would look out the single, small window, her eyes scanning the white expanse, and he would come to stand behind her, his presence a solid, reassuring wall at her back. "They'll come from the south," he said one afternoon, his voice a low rumble against her ear as they both stared out the window. "It's the only approach that offers any cover." "How many?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Ryland's a judge. He's rich, but he's not a general. He'll hire men from the saloons, men who'll do anything for a handful of silver, not soldiers. They'll be loud, and they'll be careless. 4, maybe 5, besides him." He was not just preparing the cabin, he was preparing her, arming her with knowledge, stripping away the unknown that fed her fear. On the evening of the second day, they were finished. The traps were set, the door was braced, the firewood was stacked high, the water barrels were full, and the rifle was loaded, leaning against the wall by the hearth. A heavy, expectant silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire. They had done all they could. Now, all that was left was to wait for the world to come crashing in. They ate their stew in near silence, the tension a third presence at the small table. The food was tasteless in their mouths. When they were done, Tessa took the bowls to the washing basin. As Elias stood up, his shadow fell over her. She turned and found him standing impossibly close. The air between them grew thick, charged with all the fear, the exhaustion, and the fierce, unspoken bond that had been forged in the crucible of the last few days. He reached out, not to touch her, but to take the wooden bowl from her hands, and set it aside. His gaze held hers, and in the depths of his eyes, she saw the walls he had kept around himself finally, irrevocably, crumble into dust. She saw the soldier's weariness, the hermit's loneliness, and a raw, aching need that mirrored her own. His hand came up and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking the faded line of the bruise that had been her introduction to him. His touch was not a question, but a promise. It did not ask for permission, but offered a sanctuary. "Tessa!" He breathed her name, and it was a prayer. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. In this man, she had found the one thing she thought had been lost to her forever, a safe place. He had not run from her brokenness. He had stood in front of it, a shield between her and the world. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was nothing like the first, tentative kiss. This was a kiss of desperation and homecoming, a raw, hungry claiming. It was the kiss of two people who had been starving and had finally found sustenance. She opened to him, her hands coming up to clutch at the rough wool of his shirt, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to him. He swept her into his arms, his mouth never leaving hers, and carried her the few steps to the bearskin rug before the hearth. He laid her down gently, his body covering hers, shielding her from the drafts of the cold world outside, cocooning her in his warmth and strength. The firelight danced over their faces, casting their shadows large and intertwined upon the log walls. The wind howled its lonely song, but inside their fortress, there was only the sound of their breathing, the frantic beat of their hearts, and the soft whisper of skin against skin as he slowly, reverently, undressed her. This was not a shy, fumbling encounter. It was a collision of two souls who had been wandering in the wilderness and had finally found their way home. For him, it was an awakening. A violent, beautiful return to life after years of walking death, to feel the softness of her skin, to taste the salt of her lips, to be inside another person, was to feel his own frozen heart finally, painfully, begin to beat again. For her, it was a reclamation. Every touch from Elias was a gentle rewriting of her history. His hands on her body were not cruel and taking, but worshipful and giving. His mouth on her skin did not demand, but adored. He was showing her that her body was not a thing to be used and broken, but a sacred ground to be cherished. As they moved together, a slow, deep rhythm in the firelight, the ghosts of the past were burned away in the searing, healing heat of the present. She clung to him, meeting his every thrust, her quiet sobs of release and gratitude lost against his mouth. They were two broken halves, finding a fragile, desperate wholeness in the arms of one another. Afterward, they lay tangled together on the furs, their bodies slick with sweat, their breathing slowly returning to normal. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, and the cabin was filled with a deep, peaceful dark. Tessa was curled against his side, her head on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring drum of his heart. She had never felt so utterly safe, so completely seen, and in that safety, the last, darkest secret of her heart felt its lock begin to rust and break. "He took everything from me," she whispered into the darkness, her voice muffled against his skin. Elias stroked her hair, his hand a comforting weight. "He won't take anything else." "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking. She pushed herself up on one elbow, her silhouette a dark shape against the glowing embers. It wasn't just the prospector's silver claim he wanted to hide. It was more. She took a shaky breath, and the words came out in a torrent. a poison that had been killing her from the inside out. After he locked me away, before I ran, I found out I was with child. Elias went perfectly still beneath her, his hand frozen in her hair. The only sound was the hiss of the embers. "It was Finch's," she said, her voice flat and dead. "We were fond of each other. We were going to leave together. After he filed his claim, Rylan knew. Finch had told him, had boasted about it." Her voice broke. "When Rylan killed him, he wanted to make sure there was no part of Finch left, no witness, no legacy, not even in me." She didn't need to say the rest. The horror of it hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. The forced termination, the crude, brutal act performed to erase a life and seal a secret. The ultimate violation. Elias said nothing. For a long, terrible moment, Tessa thought he was repulsed, that this final, ugly truth had broken the fragile connection between them. She started to pull away, a wave of shame and self-loathing washing over her. But his arm tightened around her, holding her fast. He sat up, pulling her with him so they were facing each other in the gloom. He reached out and gently took her face in his hands, and in the faint, red glow from the hearth, she saw that his cheeks were wet. Tears were carving silent paths through the grime and stubble of his beard. He wasn't disgusted. He was grieving with her. He leaned forward and kissed the scars she had always tried to hide, the faint, silvery lines on her stomach. He kissed them with a reverence that felt like a benediction, an absolution. He then met her eyes, his own gaze burning with a cold, righteous fury that was more terrifying than any shouting. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel the furious beating of his heart. He buried his face in her hair, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was a raw, ragged whisper, thick with a pain that was now his own. "No one," he said, his voice shaking with the force of his rage, "had the right to take that from you." They were still holding each other when the smell first reached them. Acrid smoke, sharp and unnatural, cutting through the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke from the hearth. Elias was on his feet in an instant, pulling her up behind him. An orange light was flickering unnaturally outside the single window, not the gentle light of dawn, but a hungry, dancing glow. "They're here," he said, his voice deadly calm as he grabbed his rifle. Then came a sound from outside, the triumphant, drunken whoop of a man, followed by the crash of something heavy against the cabin wall. The orange glow brightened, and they could hear the terrible, hungry roar of fire catching on dry, pitch-soaked logs. They hadn't come for a fight. They hadn't come to lay siege. They had come to burn them out, like rats in a nest. The cabin was filling with smoke, thick and choking. The heat was becoming unbearable. There was no escape through the door. "The back!" Elias yelled over the roar of the flames. He grabbed their pre-packed satchel of supplies and his axe. He ran to the back wall, the one furthest from the fire, and began to swing the axe with desperate, powerful blows against the log, chinking. Tessa coughed, her eyes streaming, her lungs screaming in protest. The smoke was a thick, blinding curtain. He smashed a hole just big enough to crawl through. "Go!" he ordered, pushing her towards the opening. "Go! I'm right behind you!" She tumbled out of the hole, from the roaring hell of the cabin into the freezing, wind-swept chaos of the blizzard that had started up again. The cold was a shock, but the air was clean, and she gasped it in, her lungs burning. A moment later, Elias was beside her, pulling her to her feet. Behind them, the cabin was an inferno, a roaring pyre against the swirling snow, lighting up the night with a terrifying, beautiful destruction. Their sanctuary was gone. "This way!" he yelled, grabbing her hand and pulling her away from the light, up the mountain, into the concealing darkness of the forest and the blinding white of the storm. They ran, stumbling through the deep snow, the shouts of Ryland's men fading behind them, swallowed by the wind and the roar of the fire. They didn't stop until their lungs were bursting and their legs were numb. Elias found a shallow overhang of rock, a small cave barely deep enough to shield them from the worst of the wind. They collapsed inside, huddling together for warmth on the frozen stone floor, their bodies trembling from cold and adrenaline. They had lost everything. They were homeless, hunted, with only a rifle, a blanket, and a handful of food. They were trapped on a frozen mountain in the middle of a blizzard. The cold was a living thing, seeping into their bones, promising a slow, quiet death. But as Elias wrapped the single blanket around them both and pulled Tessa tight against his chest, he could feel the frantic, defiant beat of her heart against his. Their shelter was gone, but they were alive, and they were together. The world outside was a maelstrom of ice and wind, but in their small, desperate refuge, a fierce, stubborn fire was burning. The dawn that broke over the Rockies was a cold, indifferent slate gray. In the cramped stone overhang, the blizzard had dwindled to a relentless, whispering snowfall. Every gust of wind was a thief, stealing what little warmth their bodies could generate, huddled under the single, smoky-smelling blanket. They had survived the night, but survival was a currency that bought you only a few more hours of suffering. Elias watched Tessa as she slept, a fitful, shallow sleep. Her face, illuminated by the pale morning light, was thin and etched with exhaustion. Her breathing still had the faint, telltale rattle of a deep-seated injury. They could not stay here. They couldn't outrun the cold, and they couldn't outrun a man like Ryland. He would send men to scour every inch of this mountain. Running was a slow death. Hiding was a temporary one. A hard, cold certainty settled in his soul, as solid and unmoving as the granite around them. For 6 years, he had run from the world of men. He had built a fortress of solitude and told himself it was peace. But it wasn't peace. It was a long, slow surrender. Now, the war had followed him up his mountain, had burned down his life and threatened the one thing that had made him feel alive again. You couldn't run from a rot like Ryland. You had to cut it out. When Tessa awoke, she saw the decision in his eyes. "I'm going down," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "To Argent Falls." Fear, stark and immediate, seized her. She sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest. "No, Elias, no! You can't. He'll kill you. They all will. They'll hang you for a thief or shoot you for a trespasser. He'll make it look like the law." "I've been running my whole life," he said, his gaze fixed on the gray world beyond their shelter. "First from a war, then from what came after. All it got me was a burned-out cabin. The only way this ends is if I end it." "He's a judge. He has men. He has the whole town," she pleaded, her voice breaking. She crawled across the cold stone floor and grabbed the front of his buckskin shirt, her knuckles white. Finch stood up to him, and they put him in the ground. "Don't die for me. Elias, please. I can't watch that happen again." He looked down at her, at the raw terror in her eyes, and his expression softened. He gently took her hands in his. "I'm not dying for you, Tessa," he said, his voice a low, fierce rumble. "I'm fighting for us. There's a difference." He stood and picked up the rifle, checking the action with a practiced efficiency. He then turned and held it out to her. She stared at it, confused. "You know how to use it?" he asked. She nodded numbly. "My father taught me." "Good," he said. "Stay here. Stay hidden. If anyone but me comes back, don't hesitate." He pressed the cold, heavy rifle into her hands. It was the ultimate act of trust, the most valuable thing he owned, and he was leaving it to protect her. He took a small pouch of jerky, his knife, and his axe. "I will be back by nightfall." He kissed her then, a hard, desperate kiss that was both a promise and a farewell. Then he turned and walked out into the snow, a solitary, determined figure descending the mountain to face the world he despised. The walk to Argent Falls was a descent into hell. Every step took him further from the clean silence of the peaks and closer to the dirty noise of humanity. By the time he reached the muddy, slush-filled Main Street, he was no longer Elias Rourke, the hermit. He was a specter of the war, a man with nothing left to lose and a righteous fury burning in his gut. He didn't go to the judge's chambers or the sheriff's office. He went to the place where the heart of the town beat its corrupt rhythm, the Gilded Cage Saloon. He pushed through the bat-wing doors and stood for a moment, letting the room's occupants take him in. The place fell silent. Miners, merchants, and drifters turned from their cards and their whiskey to stare at the wild man who had appeared in their midst. His face was grim, his beard frosted with ice, and his eyes held a cold fire that made even the hardest men look away. He saw Ryland at a corner table, holding court with the town's sheriff and a land speculator. The judge was smiling, a picture of smug authority, a glass of brandy in his hand. When he saw Elias, his smile faltered, replaced by a look of cold, murderous rage. Elias walked toward him, his boots heavy on the sawdust-covered floor. He stopped at the table, ignoring the sheriff, who had put a hand on his pistol. "Rourke," Ryland sneered. Recovering his composure, "I see you received my letter. Have you come to your senses? Where's my property?" Elias looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Your letter," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire saloon to hear, "was an interesting piece of work. Judge, it spoke of consequences. It spoke of you coming for her yourself. It sounded less like a legal notice and more like a threat from a common bully." Ryland's face flushed. "You are in no position to—" "I am in a position to tell these good people what kind of justice is being dispensed in this town." Elias cut him off, his voice ringing with authority. He swept his gaze across the silent, watching faces. "This is a man who claims a human being is his property. This is a man who hires thugs to burn down a man's home in the middle of the night to settle a personal score." A murmur went through the room. "Lies!" Ryland roared, slamming his fist on the table. "This man is a squatter and a thief, harboring a known criminal." "Am I?" Elias said calmly. "Or am I a man who gave shelter to a woman who was fleeing for her life? A woman who witnessed you, Judge Ryland, murder a prospector named Finch in cold blood to steal his silver claim." The saloon erupted. The name Finch was known to many of them. He had been a popular, if unlucky, prospector. His death had been ruled a self-defense killing, but there had been whispers. "Preposterous!" Ryland sputtered, his face now pale. "The woman is a liar and a harlot." "Is she?" Elias's voice dropped, becoming deadly quiet. "Or is she just one of many? Tell me, Judge, how many other claims have you acquired after their owners met with unfortunate accidents?" He was bluffing, but he was striking a nerve. He could see it in the shifting eyes of the men in the room, the way they looked at Ryland, then at each other. He was planting a seed of doubt, and it was taking root in the fertile ground of their own greed and suspicion. "That's enough, Rourke," the sheriff said, finally drawing his pistol. "You're under arrest for slander." "Is telling the truth slander now, Sheriff?" Elias didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on Ryland's. "Or is it just inconvenient for your master?" It was then that a new voice cut through the tension. A woman's voice, trembling but clear. "He's telling the truth." All heads turned. In the doorway stood a woman named Martha, a widow who did laundry for the miners. Her face was pale and drawn, her hands twisted in her apron. She was known as a quiet, God-fearing woman who kept to herself. She took a hesitant step into the room, her eyes fixed on Judge Ryland with a look of pure, terrified defiance. "My husband, Thomas, he had the claim on Miller's Creek," she said, her voice growing stronger. "He wouldn't sell it to the judge. A month later, there was a cave-in, an accident. They said, 2 weeks after the funeral, Judge Ryland came to my house. He had papers. He said my husband owed him money, a gambling debt. He took the claim as payment, but my Thomas, he never gambled a day in his life." She was crying now, tears of grief and long-suppressed rage. "He threatened me. He said if I ever told anyone, He'd see to it my boy was sent to an orphanage and I was sent to the brothel." The saloon was dead silent. The men looked from the weeping, credible widow to the pale, sweating judge. The carefully constructed edifice of Ryland's authority crumbled into dust. He was no longer a powerful judge. He was just a thief and a bully, exposed in the court of public opinion. The land speculator at Ryland's table quietly stood up and moved away. The miners, men who lived and died by the sanctity of a claim, looked at Ryland with open contempt. The sheriff, seeing the tide turn so violently, holstered his pistol, his face a mask of uncertainty. He was a dog whose master had just been revealed as a fraud. A miner, a big man with a pick-handle scar on his face, stepped forward. "I think the judge owes us an explanation." Soon, others joined him. The saloon, which had been Ryland's court, was suddenly a courtroom with him as the defendant. He was stripped of his title, his power evaporated by the simple, powerful light of the truth. He would not be arrested. Not yet. The official law was still a tangled mess. But he was broken. Elias had not brought formal justice, but he had brought a reckoning. It was a temporary victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Elias slipped out of the saloon during the commotion. His work done, he made his way out of town and began the long climb back up the mountain. A grim satisfaction warring with a deep, cold unease. It had been too easy. Men like Ryland, cornered and humiliated, did not simply surrender. They lashed out. The sun was setting as he reached the high country, casting long, purple shadows across the snow. He called her name as he approached the rock overhang, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. "Tessa!" There was no answer, only the mournful sigh of the wind. He scrambled into the small cave. It was empty. The blanket was tossed aside, and lying on the cold stone floor, where she must have dropped it in the struggle, was his rifle. A fresh wave of panic, cold and sharp, washed over him. He ran outside, his eyes scanning the snow. He found what he was looking for almost immediately. Tracks. The deep, churning trail of at least 3 men. The scuffed, dragged marks of a struggle, and the parallel lines of a sleigh's runners, heading not down toward the town, but further up, deeper into the unforgiving wilderness of the high peaks. Ryland hadn't waited. While Elias had been facing him down, his men had circled around and come from above. They had taken her. A roar of pure, primal rage tore from Elias's throat, a sound that was more animal than human. It echoed off the silent peaks and was lost in the vast, cold indifference of the mountains. He grabbed his axe from his belt, his knuckles white. There was no thought, no plan. There was only the trail, and the all-consuming fire of his need to get her back. He began to run, following the tracks into the descending twilight. A hunter in the deepest, darkest sense of the word. He would find them, and this time there would be no words, only a final, brutal justice delivered by his own hand. Night fell, and with it, the temperature plummeted. The wind, a constant, abrasive force, drove the snow in horizontal sheets, erasing the world, but it could not erase the trail. For Elias, the tracks of the sleigh were a burning line seared into the landscape, the only thing that existed in his universe. He was no longer a man. He was an engine of pure, cold rage, fueled by a love so fierce it had become a part of his very being. He ran, his body a well-honed machine. The skills he had learned for survival were now instruments of vengeance. He moved through the timber, using the trees for cover, his stride long and sure even in the deep drifts. He was not on the trail. He was parallel to it, a gray wolf shadowing its prey. The burning in his lungs was nothing. The ache in his legs was nothing. The only thing he felt was the thrumming, singular purpose of the hunt. An hour bled into 2. The storm began to show signs of breaking, the wind lessening its shriek, the snowfall thinning. In the ethereal light of a rising moon filtering through the clouds, he finally saw them. A single horse pulling a small sleigh, moving slowly through a difficult pass a half-mile ahead. One man was driving. A second, smaller figure was huddled in the back. Tessa. He knew this terrain better than the lines on his own hand. They were following the winding, safer path. He saw a ridge to his left, a steep, treacherous climb that would cut the distance in half and bring him out just ahead of them, where the pass narrowed between two towering monoliths of granite. He didn't hesitate. He scrambled up the rock face, his fingers finding purchase in icy cracks, his boots scraping for a hold, the axe in his belt digging into his back. He was a creature of the mountain, and it was his greatest ally. He reached the top, his breath tearing at his throat, and positioned himself behind a snow-dusted boulder just as the sleigh came into view below. The driver was a big man, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a thick buffalo coat. Elias recognized him as one of the men from the saloon, a hired thug named Cole with a reputation for casual cruelty. Elias waited until the horse was nearly level with his position. Then, with a guttural roar, he launched himself from the rock, landing in a spray of snow and ice directly in the sleigh's path. The horse reared, screaming in terror. Cole, caught completely by surprise, fought with the reins, his face a mask of shock and fury in the moonlight.
"Rourke, you crazy son of a—"
He didn't get to finish. Elias was on him, fueled by a primal fury. He swung his axe, not the blade, but the heavy, flat back of it, catching Cole in the shoulder with a sickening crunch of bone. The man howled in pain but didn't go down. He was immensely strong. He let go of the reins and drew a long, gleaming Bowie knife, lunging at Elias. The fight was a brutal, clumsy dance of death in the snow. It had none of the grim order of a battlefield. It was raw, desperate, and hateful. Elias parried the knife thrusts with the handle of his axe, the ringing of steel on the steel echoing in the silent pass. Cole was a brawler, swinging wildly, trying to overpower him. Elias was a soldier, precise and deadly, looking for an opening. He saw it when Cole overcommitted to a swing. Elias ducked under the man's arm and drove the handle of his axe hard into Cole's ribs. The man grunted, the air leaving his lungs. But as he stumbled back, he slashed out with the knife. Elias tried to twist away, but the blade caught him high on the left side, a searing, white-hot line of agony that tore through his coat and flesh. The pain was dizzying, but the sight of Tessa, struggling against her bonds in the back of the sleigh, cleared his head. He ignored the fire in his side and pressed the attack. He feinted high with the axe, and as Cole raised his arm to block, Elias drove his boot hard into the man's knee. The joint gave way with a wet, popping sound. Cole screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and fell to his knees in the snow. Elias stood over him, axe raised, his chest heaving. Cole looked up, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. "The judge! He'll pay you double!" he gasped. For a moment, the ghost of the old Elias, the man who had seen too much killing, hesitated, but then he looked past Cole, to Tessa, and he saw the bruises on her face. He remembered the story of her stolen child. He thought of his burned-out home, and the hesitation vanished. He brought the blade of the axe down. It was not justice, it was an ending. He stood for a long moment, breathing hard, the blood from his side steaming as it dripped onto the snow. Then he stumbled toward the sleigh.
"Tessa!"
he gasped, his vision starting to swim. She wasn't moving. She was slumped against the side of the sleigh, a dark stain spreading across the front of her dress. He fumbled with the ropes binding her hands, his fingers clumsy and slick with his own blood. As he cut her free, her body went limp, and a terrible, gurgling sound came from her throat. He turned her over. In the moonlight, her face was a deathly white, her lips blue, her eyes were half open, unseeing. She was choking. He saw the bloody froth on her lips and knew, with a sudden, soul-crushing terror, that her lung had given way completely. The stress, the cold, the struggle, it had been too much. She was drowning in her own blood. No, he whispered, the word a raw prayer. No, you don't. He pulled her out of the sleigh and laid her in the snow, tilting her head back. There was no time for finesse, no time for anything but the most brutal, desperate act of survival. He hooked his fingers into her mouth, forcing her jaw open. He could feel the warm, thick fluid flooding her throat. He had to clear it. He had to make her breathe. Without a second thought, he lowered his head and sealed his mouth over hers, not to breathe air in, but to pull the death out. He sucked the blood and fluid from her airway, the coppery, metallic taste filling his senses, and spat it onto the snow. Again and again, he repeated the horrific, life-giving act, his own blood mingling with hers, his world narrowing to this one, singular task. He was breathing for her, fighting for her, pulling her back from the precipice with the sheer force of his will. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he felt a faint, shuddering tremor in her chest. Her body convulsed, and she coughed. A weak, wet, but real cough. Air. She was getting air. Her eyelids fluttered, and a flicker of consciousness returned to her eyes. He collapsed beside her, his head on her chest, listening to the fragile, rasping sound of her breath. He was dizzy from blood loss, his side a universe of pain, but he had never felt such a profound, triumphant sense of relief. He had won. They had won. They lay there, two broken figures in the snow, as the long, brutal night finally began to surrender. The storm had passed. The clouds began to part in the east, revealing a sky bruised with the first hints of dawn. A soft, pinkish light crept over the peaks, illuminating a world that had been washed clean. The snow began to glisten. The first drops of melting ice fell from the granite cliffs. A sound like quiet, cleansing tears. Elias helped her to her feet. They clung to each other, two survivors on a silent battlefield, and watched the sunrise. It was the first sunrise of the rest of their lives, a brilliant, blazing promise of a new day, a new world. They stood in the light, their shadows long behind them, and let its warmth wash over their faces. He got her onto the horse and, leading it by the reins, began the slow, painful walk back down the mountain. They didn't speak. There were no words for what had passed between them. They stopped at the blackened, skeletal ruins of the cabin. It was a cold, desolate grave, smoke still curling from the charred logs. Everything they had built together in that small space was gone. It was a testament to the fact that there was no life for them here. Not anymore. "We can't stay," he said, his voice hoarse. "Ryland's power in Argent Falls is broken, but the rot is still in the roots. Men like him have long memories. We'll never be safe here." She looked at the ruins, then at him, her eyes clear and steady. "Then we go." "West," he said, a direction that was also a dream. "To Oregon. There's good land there. A man and a woman can start over. Build a new life, where no one knows their name." "A new life," she repeated, the words tasting of hope. They took nothing from the ruins but an old iron pot that had survived the flames. They took the horse and the few supplies from the sleigh, and without a backward glance, they left the mountain that had been both their prison and their sanctuary. They headed west, into the vast, unknown expanse of the continent. Their journey was a long, hard prayer. They traveled for weeks, then months. The landscape changed from snow-covered peaks to vast, empty plains, then to rolling, green hills. They faced hunger, dust storms, swollen rivers, and the quiet, constant threat of a land that was still wild and untamed. But through it all, they were no longer two separate people. They were a single unit, a partnership forged in fire and blood. She tended to the wound in his side, cleaning it with boiled water and her own quiet competence. He hunted for their food and cared for her fragile health, watching her constantly, making sure she rested. His gaze a protective shield around her. They moved like a husband and wife, falling into the familiar rhythms of a shared life. They spoke of the future, not as a vague hope, but as a certainty, a house they were building together, word by word, mile by mile. One evening, they made camp beside a small, clear creek under a canopy of stars so bright they looked like spilled diamonds. The air was soft and warm. Tessa was stronger now. The color had returned to her cheeks, and the rattle in her lungs had faded to a quiet whisper. They sat together by the fire, sharing a small piece of roasted rabbit. She was quiet for a long time, watching the flames dance. Then she turned to him, a small, genuine smile on her face, the first he had ever truly seen. She reached out and took his hand. "I can breathe now," she said softly, her voice clear and steady. "When I'm with you, I can finally breathe." Elias looked at her, at the woman who had faced death and chosen life, the woman who had taught his frozen heart how to feel again. He had no words for the ocean of emotion that swelled inside him. He was not a man of pretty speeches. His love was a thing of action, of quiet, unshakable truth. He said nothing. He simply tightened his grip on her hand, a firm, steady pressure that said everything. "I know. I am here. You are safe. Forever." And in the silent, speaking language of their shared touch, they sealed their promise to the future, and to each other. The year that followed was a quiet mending. The high, unforgiving peaks of the Colorado Rockies faded into memory, replaced by the soft, green abundance of Oregon. They found their place in a valley nestled between hills thick with Douglas fir and cedar, where the air was moist and smelled of damp earth and new life. The silence here was different. It wasn't the vast, empty silence of the high altitude, but a living quiet, filled with the gentle murmur of a nearby creek, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, and the sigh of the wind through a million green needles. Elias built their home with his own hands, just as he had before. But this time, it was different. It was not a fortress against the world, but a house meant to welcome it in. He built a wide porch that faced the sunset and cut 2 large windows into the south-facing wall, letting the light pour in. He was still a man of few words, but the hard, brittle shell around him had been worn away, eroded by the steady, gentle current of his life with Tessa. The lines around his eyes were still there, but they were softened now, crinkling when he watched her work in her garden, a quiet satisfaction replacing the old, haunted vigilance. Tessa, in turn, had bloomed. The healing Oregon air, the safety of her life with Elias, and the simple passage of time had worked a profound alchemy on her. The color had returned to her cheeks, a healthy, sun-kissed blush. The frail, bird-like quality was gone, replaced by a quiet, grounded strength. The deep, rattling cough that had been the soundtrack to their first months together was now just a ghost, a memory that only surfaced on the coldest nights. She had planted a garden behind the cabin, a small, vibrant patch of earth where she coaxed life from the soil. She grew herbs for healing, yarrow and comfrey, lavender and mint, and vegetables for their table. The garden was her testament, a living symbol of her own return to the world. To watch her kneeling in the dirt, her hands covered in soil, her face serene as she tended to a new shoot, was to watch a woman who had finally found her roots. They lived as husband and wife in every way that mattered. There was no preacher, no piece of paper from a courthouse to sanctify their union. Their vows had been taken in a burning cabin, their bond forged in blood and sealed in the silent, desperate flight toward a new life. Their days fell into a simple, peaceful rhythm. He would hunt and chop wood, maintaining the perimeter of their small world, while she tended the home and her garden. They were 2 halves of a whole, moving in a seamless, unspoken harmony. Their intimacy was no longer a desperate, feverish thing, but a quiet, steady flame, a constant source of warmth and light in the center of their lives. One afternoon in late autumn, a traveling peddler made his way up their valley. his cart laden with the odds and ends of the civilized world they had left behind. Elias traded a fine beaver pelt for a sack of flour, a block of salt, and a small tin of coffee. The peddler, a garrulous old man named Abernathy, wrapped the coffee in a sheet of newspaper from Portland, one that was already several weeks old. That evening, as Tessa prepared their meal, Elias sat by the fire, sipping the rich, dark coffee. He idly smoothed out the crumpled newspaper Abernathy had used for wrapping. He scanned the headlines, local politics, shipping news, advertisements for farm equipment, and then a small article, tucked away at the bottom of a page, caught his eye. The headline was simple: "Justice in Argent Falls." His body went still. He read the article, his eyes moving quickly over the dense print. It detailed the final, ignominious downfall of Judge Marcus Ryland. After Elias's confrontation in the saloon and the widow Martha's testimony, other voices had finally found their courage. More stories had emerged, of threats, of stolen claims, of a quiet, pervasive corruption that had held the town in its grip for years. A federal marshal had been dispatched from Denver, not Ryland's cousin, but a hard, impartial man who could not be bought. A proper investigation had been launched. Ryland had been formally charged, tried, and convicted of the murder of the prospector, Finch, as well as numerous counts of fraud and extortion. He was to be hanged at the end of the month. Elias read the article 3 times, the words blurring slightly. He felt a grim, final satisfaction, but it was a distant thing, like an echo from another life. The war was finally, truly over. He folded the paper carefully and looked over at Tessa. She was humming a quiet tune as she stirred a pot over the fire, her face soft and content in the warm light. His first instinct was to burn the paper, to protect her from this ghost from their past, to let the memory of that place and that man die completely. But he knew he could not. Her story was her own. Her healing had to be complete, and that meant facing the end of the chapter, not just turning the page. "Tessa," he said, his voice quiet. She turned, a smile on her face. "The stew is almost ready." He held out the newspaper. "I think you should read this." She looked from his face to the paper, and her smile faded. She saw the gravity in his eyes. She wiped her hands on her apron and came over, taking the paper from him. She sat on the small stool beside him and began to read. He watched her face, watched as her eyes moved over the words. He saw the color drain from her cheeks, saw her hands begin to tremble, saw the way her breath hitched in her throat. When she finished, she did not speak. She simply sat there, staring at the paper, her face a pale, unreadable mask. Then, a single tear escaped from her eye and traced a slow path down her cheek. It was followed by another, and another, until silent. Racking sobs shook her entire body. Elias's heart ached. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her as she wept. She buried her face in his chest, her tears soaking his shirt, and cried with a lifetime of pent-up grief and terror. But as he held her, he realized she was not crying for the horror of what had been done. She was not crying for the justice that had finally been served. She was crying for the girl who had been so terrified, the girl who had thought she would never be safe again. These were the tears of a flood, washing away the last of the poison, the last of the fear that had lingered in the deepest corners of her soul. She was crying because she was finally, completely, irrevocably free. He held her for a long time, rocking her gently, saying nothing, just offering the solid, unwavering anchor of his presence until the storm of her tears subsided into a quiet, shuddering peace. A few days later, Elias went into the woods. He walked for nearly an hour until he found what he was looking for, a small, ancient oak tree that stood on a rise overlooking their valley. He took out his knife and carefully cut a small, healthy branch. He brought it back to the cabin and, for the next several evenings, he sat on the porch as the sun went down, and he carved. He was not a man who spoke of his feelings. but he could pour them into the things he made with his hands. He worked the wood slowly, patiently, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He carved away the bark, smoothed the surface with a piece of sandstone, and hollowed out the center until it was a perfect, simple ring. It had no adornments, no jewels. It was just the wood, its grain a unique, swirling pattern, its surface warm and smooth to the touch. That evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sky bleed from orange to purple, he took her hand. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. He said nothing, but simply slipped the wooden ring onto her fourth finger. It fit perfectly. She looked down at the ring, then back up at him, her eyes shining with a deep, quiet understanding. This was not a proposal. A proposal was a question about the future. This was a statement of fact, a confirmation of the present. This was an acknowledgement of what they already were, what they had been since the moment they had decided to face the world together. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He just nodded, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. Words were unnecessary. The ring, born of the earth of their new home, was his heart, made tangible. They sat in a comfortable silence, her head resting on his shoulder, his arms securely around her. The first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The air grew cool, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a peaceful night. There was no one hunting them. There was no judgment waiting for them down in the valley. There were no ghosts here, only the quiet, steady presence of a life they had built together, a peace they had earned with blood and tears. He looked out at the dark, silent forest, and he felt no loneliness, only a profound sense of rightness, of being exactly where he was supposed to be. The world had seen her as a piece of property, a mail-order bride to be bought and claimed, but he knew the truth. She was not just a mail-order bride. She was the woman who had made an entire frozen mountain learn how to love. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to hear where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and let us know. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to our channel, From Wild West, and share your thoughts with us.